Hello, and welcome to the 10th episode of Season 2 of the Dark Money Files, in which we shine a light into a murky world. I'm Ray Blake, and with me is my co-host, friend and business partner, Graham Barrow. Hello, Graham.
Hello, Ray.
And you've been on the TV since last week then, Graham?
Well, yes, Ray, I have. I was interviewed by DR, which is kind of the same as the BBC, only in Denmark.
Well, how exciting. Tell us some more about it.
Well, I'd love to, because I'm that sort of person. So I was approached a couple of weeks ago to see if I'd like to review some leaked material and then be interviewed about it.
That must have been a difficult question for you to answer, Graham.
You know me so well, Ray. No, especially as it was clearly involving Danske Bank, and actually it was considered so sensitive that the reporter and the cameraman were going to fly over to the UK with the original paperwork because they just weren't prepared to risk sending it electronically.
Blimey. So what was it all about then?
Well, Ray, let's start at the beginning, because frankly that's the way we like to do things, isn't it? If you turn to page 56 of the B&H report, the Brun and Hehler report, there is a brief mention in paragraph 9.4.8, headed, Continued Investigations into the Whistleblower Allegations, and it refers to an external consultancy report commissioned by Group Legal to look into, quotes, allegations of misconduct and, quotes, critical information on a number of irregularities involving senior members of staff.
Now, I remember that bit. Wasn't it subsequently cancelled?
Yes, it was. The report simply says that the decision was overturned by, quote, 2 members of the executive board.
Now, that in itself is problematic, given that the report quotes irregularities involving senior members of staff. And this was an external consultancy who could reasonably held to be both untainted by any allegations and neutral in its approach.
Well, exactly. And the task was handed to Group Compliance and AML, who honestly can't really be categorised in quite the same way.
And in addition, they were tasked with, quotes, bringing this whistleblower matter to an end, quotes, which sounds a bit sinister and certainly isn't the same as investigating the underlying issues identified by the whistleblower.
Yeah, and what's almost worse is that, according to the report, Group Legal provided what was referred to as, quotes, the full list of allegations. But in reality, some were only referred to in really quite broad terms, and others were left out entirely, which included the allegations of internal collusion and others relating to the Danish KS companies, which are the equivalent of limited partnerships.
And reading the report again, it seems clear that some of the outcomes of that internal report were pretty unsatisfactory.
Yeah, so what struck you particularly?
I think it was the fact that when Group Compliance and AML circulated an overview of this incomplete list of allegations to 2 members of the executive board, it contained phrases like, quotes, beside the action points, no more action will be done due to the specific allegations, quotes. And that they would be following, quotes, the progress of the suggested actions, quotes.
That's not actually a very robust approach, is it?
Well, it doesn't sound like one. And I wonder who those 2 board members were.
Well, I don't know, Ray, but you just can't help wondering if it was the same 2 board members who overturned the decision to go externally.
Indeed. The other thing that strikes me about the report is that 2 whistleblower allegations were apparently still in the process of being verified. 7 others were either not verified or only partly verified. And not only had very little action been identified at that point, but B&H were unable to find any information about additional investigation into the whistleblower's accusations after that.
I fancy that wouldn't be allowed to happen today, Ray.
Well, no, Graham, it wouldn't. That would not stand. So, what additional information did this new leak throw out?
Well, quite a bit. The TV people had obtained a copy of I suppose you'd call them the terms of reference, for the external firm to work to, as well as some internal emails which reference the report and the decision to cancel it.
Wow, that's a significant leak. Who was the firm?
They were called Parsifal Services and were a fairly new company. It's comprised of ex-police officers and the former head of DR.
DR?
Hmm.
You mean the TV station who sent people out to interview you?
Yes.
Oh.
And Parsifal actually went bust a year or so later under something of a cloud. But well, I think that's another story.
Well, so many stories, Graham. But anyway, back to the report. What were they asked to do?
Well, Ray, quite a lot. They were given permission to access all emails and taped phone calls of anyone concerned in the whistleblower leaks. They were asked to interview senior managers in both Estonia and Copenhagen. And to be honest, there was quite a focus on looking into the life of Howard Wilkinson, the whistleblower, including not just his work emails and phone calls, but also things like his social media activity and other things like that.
Well, almost as if they were trying to see if there was anything which could counteract his whistleblowing.
Yeah, it does read a bit like that, yes.
And once again, you'd need to be very careful with that these days. Whistleblower protections are there for a purpose. I think it's fair to say he's pretty much sacrificed not just his career, but his working life since being outed. And it's a high price to pay, as it is, without someone going digging for anything that could cause your evidence to be doubted or could undermine you in some other way. It just seems very unfair.
It does, and not that we're suggesting, of course, that they were, but it does read that way.
Okay, so to recap then, Parsifal Services had been commissioned to investigate, both in Estonia and in Denmark, to go wherever the evidence led, interview anyone, however senior, if the need arose, to have access to emails and phone records, and they were flying out the next day to start the investigation in Tallinn.
Yes, they were asked to provide their preliminary report by mid-June, and this was all confirmed in an email that was sent around midday on, as I recall, the 13th of May. And sometime between then and the following morning, these two, quotes, senior members of the management, quotes, scrapped the entire project.
But Graham, a project like this would surely have to be commissioned by senior managers. You can't go approving access to emails right across the company, access to phone records and giving people the right on demand to senior management interviews, unless the decision to allow that was taken at the very highest level.
Well, Ray, I agree. I mean, yes, and let's be honest, the consequences of that decision are pretty far-reaching.
Well, yes. Returning to the B&H report briefly, it goes on to say on page 57 that internal audit asked business banking for an update on the whistleblower investigation. And on the 7th of July 2014, they replied that, quotes, the allegations made by the whistleblower have all been investigated, quotes. And in internal audit's status report for Q3 2014, they included a comment that they, quote, still agreed with the comments made by business banking, quotes. And that included the comment that the allegations made by the whistleblower had all been investigated. And I just wonder about the nature of that investigation, given that the one that was all ready to launch was shut down at, 12 hours notice.
Yeah, I agree. And just it sounds a bit odd given, that a few months earlier they were deemed so serious to warrant, a specialist external investigations company to be given access to just about everything and everyone who could help bring these matters to light.
I mean, it may not have been a cover-up, but optically, it isn't a great way to deal with what we now know to have been a very serious situation.
Well, look, Ray, I've seen the bank statements from 2007, which is 7 years before all this, and it wouldn't take much for someone with an ounce of common sense and one eye, frankly, to work out that what was going on in the non-resident portfolio simply could not be explained in any rational
Mm,
manner. Brand new companies with no internet presence simply can't put $1.2 billion of trading activity through their books in the space of 14
mm,
months without a single bit of it being in the public domain.
mm. So, whatever investigations internal audit did, it wouldn't appear to have involved actually looking at the account activity.
Well, no, Ray, they can't have done. I've actually downloaded the account filings for 8 of the limited liability partnerships, which were the recipients or payees of the vast majority of that 1.2 billion, along with the accounts for the LLP that had all that money going through it. Now, every single one of them was signed by either Stan Gorin or Eric Vanagels or both. And every one of them was signed on behalf of either Ireland and Overseas Acquisitions or Milltown Corporate Services or both.
And how much profit were those companies showing, Graham?
On the filed accounts, the lowest was £8,215 and the highest was £49,417.
So these 8 UK LLPs, who between them account for several £100 million in transactions through one account over a 12-month period, returned total combined profits in their company's house filings over the same period of about £300,000.
Ray, that is exactly right. And the ninth LLP, which received and paid out this 1.2 billion, filed just one set of accounts over that time, and that showed commission income of 43,689 quid.
Wow. So, Graham, I have to ask this. A, how long did that take to work out? And more importantly, from my point of view, how much did all that research cost us?
I'm really sorry about this, Ray. It took me at least 2 hours, and it cost me £9.
£9. Okay, well, I think we can afford that, Graham. And I think that we can say that unequivocally, anyone looking at that account activity should have found it suspicious.
Yes.
Which leads us on to the point where Danske could well be facing significant jeopardy.
I think it does, Ray, and hence the point of that slightly detailed explanation. So, do you want to elucidate?
Yes, absolutely. There is a phrase that we are going to hear quite a lot of in a minute called reasonable grounds. I'll just foreshadow that slightly. Now, the law will be framed slightly differently in Denmark, but nevertheless, it's a criminal offence for an obliged entity to fail to report where suspicious activity has been detected.
And that applies, doesn't it, Ray, both internally and externally?
Yes, let's go into a bit more detail. In the UK, the requirement to report is covered largely by the Proceeds of Crime Act of 2002, universally known as POCA or POCA, although there are similar requirements in the Terrorism Act of 2000. There are 2 separate requirements to report a suspicion, one of which is placed on those working within a regulated firm to report their suspicions to the nominated officer. And the second is imposed on that nominated officer, if the suspicion warrants it, to report their suspicions to the relevant authority, in our case, the National Crime Agency.
Yes, and there are conditions attaching to both of those offences, though, aren't there?
Yes, Graham. For the failure to report internally, the demand is quite high. The Act stipulates that if you know or suspect, or if there are, here it comes, reasonable grounds for you to know or suspect, you should disclose.
Yeah, so if the view is that you should have known but didn't disclose, you have still committed an offence.
Yes, although there's clearly scope in interpreting how to measure reasonable grounds for knowing or suspecting, but there is another condition, which is that the information on which the suspicion is based should come through the course of their business in the regulated sector.
And not just tittle tattle they hear in the pub. Yeah, okay. So
No, absolutely.
So if we look then, bearing that in mind, say at Howard Wilkinson's whistleblower report, whilst you could argue it didn't go through the normal channels, it clearly looks like he met those conditions, assuming, and I'm sure they were the same broad requirements in Estonia.
Yes, absolutely. And to be fair to Howard Wilkinson, I don't believe it was the first attempt at disclosure he'd made in that firm.
I think you're absolutely right. Yeah.
Absolutely. This information, in the light of the account activity and company filings, it seems to me is clearly suspicious and warrants a disclosure, which we could interpret the memos he sent and then the whistleblower report as meeting. We know from everything we've just discussed that this was taken seriously enough to commission an external intelligence investigation.
Yes, and that then shifts the onus to the requirement to report to the relevant authority.
Yes, that's right. And that's covered by Section 331 of POCA. This makes it a criminal offence if the nominated officer fails to disclose where he or she knows or suspect or has, here we go again, reasonable grounds for knowing or suspecting that another person is engaged in the offence of money laundering. They need to know the identity of the person or the whereabouts of the property, or that they can be identified.
I guess that's what KYC is for, isn't it?
Yeah.
It also requires you, as I understand it, to make that disclosure as soon as is practicable after the information comes to light.
Which could easily be where the problem here lies.
Exactly. Now, Ray, you've been performing this exact role up until very recently. Mm-hmm. So let me ask you a question. What would your reaction be if a report came to you identifying suspicious activity that's been going on for at least 7 years and potentially encompassing an entire section of the business and amounting to several $100 million?
Well, Graham, I'm not sure I'd sleep for about a week.
Well, and then?
Well, I'd report it, and I wouldn't wait for that sleepless week to end either. No. Of course I'd report it. I mean, in my experience, you never improve or solve a problem by ignoring it.
No, and that's exactly the reaction I expected from you. So do you think it was possible that when the senior management at Danske realised that the issues were frankly enormous and went back over a number of years, that they just might have decided to try and keep it in-house rather than let an external company loose on it?
I think it's possible. Do we know any more about why Parsifal were dropped?
Well, a bit, and from both sides. According to a report in the Danish press, the commercial director of Parsifal, who has decided to break a secrecy clause to which they were originally subjected, says that they were dropped because the case had a much greater reach than originally assessed, and because it involved Thomas Borgen, who for much of the period under review was the head of business banking in the Baltics, and of course he eventually became the CEO of the entire bank.
Hard to believe that would only have become clear 12 hours before they started work, but anything else?
Well, the same report says that sources in Danske say that they were dropped because they were a very new company and therefore not really competent to carry out the task.
Well, again, Graham, Danske had selected them. They must have known that originally. Given the seriousness of the allegations, it shouldn't have come as a surprise.
Well, no, not unless some time between the original selection process and then giving them the go-ahead, further information came to light that caused them to rethink.
Which would make more sense if they'd then gone out and appointed somebody else to do it who was more experienced and perhaps a more established firm, but that didn't happen.
Yeah, no.
And whatever it was that they were rethinking, it wasn't enough to bring to a halt the activity in Estonia. As we know, that went on until the end of 2015, 18 months later.
Yeah, and in the light of the requirements to report, that could be really quite serious, couldn't it?
Yes, failing to report is one thing. Failing to report for a period of at least 7 years is quite another. But failing to report and then carrying on servicing the business you should have reported on is about as bad as it gets.
Yeah, I mean, of course, they might have reported.
Well, they might, but if they did, it's hard to understand why many of the senior management team at Danske have subsequently been charged by the Danish authorities.
Yeah, that's a fair point.
I mean, if you report, that's a very good defence, and I don't know of anyone who's self-disclosed and subsequently been arrested if they've done it on a timely basis.
True.
Um, it doesn't end there, though, does it, Graham? How many other banks around Europe received money through the laundromat and failed to report? If the view of the authorities is that the available evidence meets the reasonable grounds for having suspicion threshold, then they're also facing the potential for criminal sanctions as well. Um, and I wonder if this is the time to start talking, although we can't do it justice here, about the whole concept of correspondent banking.
Well, yes, I mean, yes, you're absolutely right because it's not just the receiving banks who should have suspected, but those who were responsible for acting as correspondent in between.
Yeah, so probably worth starting with a fairly basic explanation of what correspondent banking means for listeners who won't be familiar with the term. Banks have bank accounts at other banks. Um, is the basic start of all of this because banks have their own cross border business to conduct both for themselves and for their clients and it's the commonest thing in the world for a bank in one country to wrap up a whole bunch of transactions that have to happen in another country and to place that as effectively one super transaction through their own bank account in that other country. So you
Hmm.
have banks like, to name two that actually were correspondent banks for Danske Bank, JP Morgan and Deutsche Bank, putting through these transactions, which are an amalgamation of lots and lots of individual Danske Bank transactions for different customers.
Yes, and of course, Danske themselves didn't actually have a dollar clearing license, so in a lot of respects, they rely
Mm,
on their correspondents to clear dollars and therefore use them for lots of other services as well because it's frankly cheaper than maintaining their own branches or gaining those licenses in lots of other different countries.
absolutely. And the whole correspondent banking model relies on the initiating bank, the bank who's actually facing the client, to do their job properly, to know the client extremely well, and to have oversight of that client's behaviour and transactions, because these aren't clients of JP Morgan or Deutsche Bank or whoever, and they have no access to information on the underlying clients at all.
No, except obviously what's in the payment file.
Mm.
So, and I think I think you started this conversation with something which I think is absolutely right, which is I think we ought to come back to correspondent banking and give it a whole episode all of its own.
Yes, and the people who were acting as correspondent banks for Danske over the period in question. I know we have listeners in those banks, and it is a subject that we do want to do some justice to. So I think it's right that we defer detailed discussion just for now.
Perfect, but
Mm.
that will make for a very interesting episode. So,
Mm.
Ray, I think what we're saying then is that the tremors caused by the Danske earthquake could rumble around the European banking sector for some considerable time yet.
Yeah, and beyond, I suspect,
Hmm.
yes. I mean, there's at least some implication that other matters, which are currently subject to legal privilege, could add significantly to our understanding of who did or didn't do what.
Yes, I know Howard Wilkinson, when he's given evidence, has referred to that more than once. So
Mm,
let's watch that space. So I think that's probably as far as we can take the story for the time being, but undoubtedly, along with the correspondent banking, I think there'll be more leaks and we'll be coming back to it again at some point soon.
I'm sure we will, Graham. So what have we got in store for the next episode?
Well, assuming nothing else happens in the earthquake lines.
That's not really a safe assumption, Graham.
It's not, but let's assume that the seismometers stay reasonably quiet for the next week or two. Amidst all this excitement around Danske Bank, Ray, we've also been involved in the launch of a couple of new products which we've helped to design. So given that we were going to do an episode on RegTech anyway, I think it would be a good idea to explain the background to the work we've been doing with a few, let's say, selected providers, and more importantly, how we think it's going to help to change the way we monitor banking transactions and the underlying relationships.
I'm looking forward to it.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Dark Money Files. We hope you enjoyed it. If you would like to listen to future episodes, please subscribe through iTunes, Spotify, or your normal podcast provider. Thanks.